Hello there, my name is Artie, and it's been a hell of a year. Here on the channel we hit 1,000 total subscribers, which is insane, and I made some of the best content I think I've ever put out. Over on the website, content unavailable, link in the description. It's been a great year too, with over 20 blog posts, including a number of Thing of the Week mini reviews, as well as a complete site overhaul. But that's all besides the point. What we're all really here for are, of course, the games. This year I played only 28 games to a substantial degree. That's less than the previous 2 years, but I feel like I played these ones through much more than in 2022 and 2023. As usual, I wanted to take this opportunity to go over each of these games and rank them on 3 scales: gameplay, graphics, and soundtrack. Each game will be given a score out of 50 for gameplay and 1 out of 25 for graphics and soundtrack, for a final total out of 100. Then, as usual, we'll have the community voted Thing of the Year awards at the end of the video. Oh, and I covered a number of these games in my aforementioned Thing of the Week blog or Thing of the Month series, so if you want to hear about them in more depth, look for this symbol in the bottom right corner, which will tell you which blog post or video that game was reviewed in. But without further ado, let's start off with... Starting the year off with an enormous bang, we have Ghost Ship Games' co-op miner shooter Deep Rock Galactic. I've made a whole video about how good this game is, so I'll try and paraphrase that one. Deep Rock is a game where you and your dwarven friends go mining in the most dangerous cave system in the universe, Hoxie's 4, extracting resources and gunning down enemies. Deep Rock is action-packed, frantic, and so much fun with friends. Last year, I said that either Warhammer Vermintide 2 or Lethal Company were the best co-op games ever made. Well, I think they might have met their match in Deep Rock Galactic. On top of its amazing and incredibly varied gameplay, DRG has some great low-poly graphics which even look gorgeous at times, especially in areas like the Azure Weald, and a blood-pumping techno soundtrack by Sophus Agerbæk-Larsen, which fits the game unbelievably well. Combine all of that with a generally awesome team of developers with a great and refreshing outlook on microtransactions, and you've got a simply spectacular video game. DRG gets a 49 for gameplay, a 21 for graphics, and a 20 for soundtrack, meaning an overall score of a nearly perfect 90 out of 100. That's our only game of January though, so let's move swiftly onward to... This month I was still playing a hell of a lot of Deep Rock Galactic. So much, in fact, that I instantly grabbed its spin-off by Fun Day Games, Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, when it came out. Survivor is a single-player roguelite bullet heaven survivors-like set in the caves of Hoxie's 4, where you make your way through a number of smaller stages, gaining and upgrading weapons until the final stage, where your ultimate goal is to eliminate the Dreadnought. Whilst definitely a departure in a lot of ways from the base game, Survivor still shares the action-packed fun of gunning down hordes of bugs. That said, whilst it is an incredibly enjoyable game, it's definitely not nearly as fun as Deep Rock itself, though that's a difficult bar to reach. Survivor also has similar graphics to Deep Rock, but gets rid of the low-poly aesthetic. It makes sense though, as everything you encounter is considerably smaller, so the art style here doesn't matter too much. The game also utilises a condensed version of Deep Rock's soundtrack, which still works really well with the game. Deep Rock Galactic Survivor gets a 39 for gameplay, an 18 for graphics, and a 20 for soundtrack, an overall score of 77 out of 100. Once again though, that was our only game of February, so next up is... This month's only game was Arrowhead Games' smash hit online co-op action shooter, Helldivers 2, which I bought at full price following all of the hype. And I must say, I kinda regret it. Listen, there is a lot to like about Helldivers 2. Community progression, great gunplay, huge explosions, and incredibly funny writing, but it really just didn't do it for me as much as I'd hoped it would. Chances are that's down to the fact that I have barely anyone to play it with, as is typical with these games, playing alone is incredibly boring, but the times that I did manage to play with a couple of others were great fun. Overall, it's a fine game, one that I'd like to play a bit more of eventually, but one that hasn't really clicked for me yet. The only thing that's kept me playing recently is a Clone Wars mod I found, which turns you into a clone trooper and automatons into droids. It's great. As for graphics, Helldivers 2 looks really good, and I especially love the design of everything. The armour looks cool as hell, and the Terminids are particularly cool looking enemies. The soundtrack by Wilbert Roget II, whilst good, is nothing too special in my eyes, just pretty generic action game music for the most part. The main theme is really good though. Helldivers 2 gets a 30 for gameplay, 22 for graphics, and a 15 for soundtrack, netting it a total score of 67 out of 100. With that over with, let's move on to... Once again, I only played one game this month. Desperate for Fallout-esque content, I finally bought inXile Entertainment's Wasteland 2. It's a really cool turn-based strategy RPG, with a lot of similar ideas to the original two Fallout games, which makes sense considering it was produced in part by Brian Fargo, founder of Fallout's Interplay Entertainment. The gameplay is super fun, and mostly consists of this XCOM-esque turn-based combat, which is an absolute blast. It also has a number of RPG elements, like character progression and story choices, which complement the game's writing and plot. I absolutely loved the fact that your choices really had an impact on your playthrough, like at the start of the game where you can choose to help out one of two locations. After you've done that and headed to the next location, it's in shambles because you helped the other location first. It's really cool. Graphically, the game looks fine, but some parts of the style haven't aged too well thanks to the fact that it's aiming for realism instead of stylization. And the soundtrack by Mark Morgan is also fine. It complements the game well enough, but there aren't really any memorable tracks from it. Overall, Wasteland 2 gets a 38 for gameplay, a 16 for graphics, and a 15 for soundtrack, giving it a total score of 69 out of 100. Next up is... This is the first month where I actually got a few games, the first of which was Killer Frequency, Team 17's puzzle horror game where you take control of Forrest Nash, a radio presenter who suddenly becomes the 911 operator of the small town of Gallows Creek after a masked serial killer prevalent in the 50s returns. This game absolutely oozes the same vibes as 80s and 90s slashers like Halloween, Friday the 13th, and especially Scream, so it definitely achieves the thematic goal it's going for. The gameplay mostly consists of solving puzzles over the phone to try and save people that call in from the killer, the Whistling Man, who is actually creepy as hell sometimes. It's a relatively short game, one that I was able to beat twice in just under 10 hours, but one that I had an absolute blast playing nonetheless. The writing is absolutely top-notch and balances horror and comedy really well, like the aforementioned Scream movies. The graphics are gorgeous, and the broadcasting room that most of the game takes place in is absolutely full of character. And, of course, the soundtrack by Matthew Sugden, Connor Tissington, and Danny Hay is spectacular too, mostly comprised of 80s synthwave music that complements the game so well. Killer Frequency gets a 42 for gameplay, a 21 for graphics, and a 21 for soundtrack, yielding an overall score of 85 out of 100. Next up is Minecraft Dungeons, the blocky dungeon crawler from Double 11 and Mojang. I played this in a bit of depth a couple of years ago, but I decided to include it here as I finally bought it on Steam and played through a lot more than I had previously. Overall, it's a solid game that sees you traversing a number of unique dungeons on your quest to defeat the evil Arch-Illager. Whilst the gameplay was generally fun, mostly comprised of hacking and slashing your way through heaps of enemies, there were some elements I wasn't too fond of, particularly the fact that secrets in each level may just not spawn. If you want to 100% a level, you'll need to play it pretty much to completion again and again and again until that particular thing you want finally appears. Aside from that though, it's a solid game, and definitely a good one to have on the Steam Deck. The graphics are fun, pretty much just normal Minecraft graphics with a bit more character, and the soundtrack, composed by a whole heap of people whose names I'll put on screen now, is overall really solid, albeit a little forgettable. It also has a ridiculous number of tracks. I don't think I've ever seen a soundtrack that takes up 8.5 gigabytes on my hard drive before. Anyway, Minecraft Dungeons gets a 35 for gameplay, 20 for graphics, and an 18 for soundtrack, netting it an overall score of 73 out of 100. Now for Mario & Rabbids Kingdom Battle, quite possibly one of the strangest crossovers I've ever played. Even stranger is the fact that it's really bloody fun. It has surprisingly similar turn-based combat to Wasteland 2, which is, of course, super fun, but slaps a Nintendo coat of paint on top for a genuinely rock-solid gameplay experience. I unfortunately don't play many Nintendo games nowadays, but playing this really made me realise what I've been missing out on. Kingdom Battle has incredibly fun turn-based gameplay that always spices things up with interesting environments, characters, or objectives, smooth and lively graphics in classic Nintendo style, and a great soundtrack by Grant Kirkhope, one of the very few Nintendo-related OSTs you'll actually find on Spotify. Kingdom Battle gets a 39 for gameplay, a 22 for graphics, and a 19 for soundtrack, so an overall score of 80 out of 100. The final game of May is Assembly Line 2 mobile version, a fairly lackluster PC port of a sequel of a game I used to obsess over as a child. To my delight, this game is even better than its predecessor, giving a more simplified version of an experience not dissimilar to Factorio, where you'll be creating a factory and obsessively attempting to optimize every section of it until it's efficient as can be. I love how logic-based this game is, and whilst it does admittedly get very repetitive over time, it is incredibly fun to write out pages of notes on how you could improve the efficiency of your production, to me at least. Assembly Line 2 has simple graphics to make it easy for you to see what's happening on screen, but no soundtrack to speak of, instead opting for clack sounds which are weirdly satisfying. For those reasons, Assembly Line 2 gets a 35 for gameplay, a 15 for graphics, and a 2 for soundtrack. That's 52 out of 100 overall. That's half the year done. So next up, it's... The first game I played in June was one that I had been anticipating since it was announced in May of the previous year. Exit 73 Studios' #Blood, a zany top-down dungeon-crawling RPG not dissimilar to the original Zelda games. Whilst I was really looking forward to playing this one, I must say I was more than a little disappointed with it. Whilst the gameplay is fine for the most part, it's much more boring than I'd have thought. For a dungeon crawler, its combat is fairly mindless and mostly consists of spamming buttons until whatever in front of you is dead. When it released, there were also a number of problems with the combat. Animations took too long and you weren't invincible for their duration, dodge rolls wouldn't dodge properly, and a couple of other things. I think they fixed those errors in a post-launch update, but it didn't stop the game's combat from being just a bit too boring. That said, the boss fights were really fun, and the art is absolutely top-notch, aiming for the same art style as late 90s, early 2000s cartoons like Dexter's Laboratory and The Fairly Odd Parents. Suffice it to say, it didn't surprise me when I learnt that the developers are primarily a graphic design studio, not a game studio. The soundtrack by Bob Fox is also alright, but a little repetitive at times. Overall, #Blood gets a 27 for gameplay, a 21 for graphics, and an 11 for soundtrack. That's a total score of 59 out of 100. Next up is Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, the open-world RPG from Insomniac Games. I've been wanting to play this for years, but a crappy PC and its steep price tag meant I couldn't until June. Holy crap, was it worth the wait though. This is easily one of the best open worlders I've ever played, and my favourite superhero game to date. There's so much to like here, from its amazing gameplay that features incredibly satisfying traversal, exciting combat, and solid puzzle solving, to its spectacular writing that feels like it's ripped straight from a volume of The Amazing Spider-Man, whilst still having its own unique story and interpretations of characters. The graphics are amazing, and despite what a lot of people online would say, I think all of the models and voice actors here are perfectly suited for their role, especially Yuri Lowenthal as Spider-Man, which feels like a match made in heaven. The soundtrack by John Paisano is incredible too, perfectly complementing every step of the game with its dynamic features. I could sing this game's praises for hours, but instead I'll summarise it into a score. An easy 47 for gameplay, 22 for graphics, and 21 for soundtrack, an overall score of 90 out of 100. That'll be hard to top, but we'll press on anyway. Next up is... For our first game of July, we have SMG Studios' Risk Global Domination, the free-to-play PC port of the strategy board game, Risk. My friends and I all decided to get this after having a particularly intense round of the board game, and we had a lot of fun playing this video game version. In Risk, you'll be moving your troops across the world, attacking countries owned by other players to try and take over the entire globe. The board game is a lot of fun, but definitely has a number of problems, some of which are fixed by the video game version. There's significantly less admin work to do as the computer does it for you, gameplay is sped up quite a bit, and it all just runs along a bit smoother. That said, there are definitely still issues with the game. Mainly, despite the digital version speeding things up, Risk takes a hell of a lot of time to complete a single game of, and most of that time is other people's turns, meaning you kinda just sat there doing nothing until someone else has their turn. On top of that, it becomes especially tedious in the final stretch, where all players have a ridiculous number of troops, meaning their turns get exponentially longer and they're exponentially more difficult to completely wipe out. Generally though, it's a solid game, and this digital port has decent graphics which make it very easy to play. I'm not sure I'm a fan of the player avatar's art style though. As for the soundtrack by Jared Underwood, it barely exists, and the tracks that are there feel very generic. Risk Global Domination gets a 35 for gameplay, a 14 for graphics, and an 8 for soundtrack. That's a total score of 57 out of 100. Next up is Monomi Park's Slime Rancher 2, which you might recognise from the end of the year video 2 years ago, where I played the game in early access and was quite disappointed. Well, I bought it again, this time on Steam instead of the Xbox Game Pass, and it's had enough updates since then that I'm happy to count it as a different game. Slime Rancher 2, I'm happy to report, has significantly improved since my last encounter with it. It's got loads more content now, including new areas, new items, and, most importantly, new slimes. It follows basically the same gameplay loop as the first one: catch slimes, feed them, sell their plorts, and upgrade your ranch, but adds a ton of new stuff to spice things up, including more detailed customization and crafting. I've been really enjoying this one, and it's the perfect game to just sit back and chill out to. The graphics are, of course, absolutely gorgeous, just look at them, and the soundtrack by Harry Mack is beautiful to listen to. Slime Rancher 2 gets a 40 for gameplay, a 23 for graphics, and a 21 for soundtrack, a total 84 out of 100. And the last game for July is Denaton Games' psychedelic top-down action shooter, Hotline Miami, easily one of the most gloriously violent games I've ever played. In Hotline Miami, you take the role of Jacket, who keeps getting calls telling him to clear out entire buildings of mafiosos. Everything about this game works perfectly with everything else. The vibrant but dirty colour scheme combined with over-the-top visuals, the energetic soundtrack by a heap of people whose names I'll put on screen now, and the fast-paced gameplay that'll have you making split-second decisions so as not to die immediately. I especially love the difficulty of the game, and how the fact that you can die in just a single hit makes it so much more fun, as well as how everything complements the writing, particularly after you've completed a run and the music suddenly stops, meaning you have to walk in silence through the building you just cleared, seeing what you've done as you make your way back to the entrance to complete the level. The game is incredibly fun overall, and for that reason it gets a 43 for gameplay, a 20 for graphics, and a 19 for soundtrack, netting a total score of 82 out of 100. Now to move on over to... First up is Root, Direwolf's digital port of the board game of the same name by Letter Games. I got this one so I could practice the game before playing the physical copy with some friends. Despite my practice, I still got my ass kicked, but I don't think that's because of the digital port. The game is very fun. It's an asymmetrical turn-based strategy game, not dissimilar from Risk back in July, just with unique factions. Each of these factions has different rules and abilities, and no two are remotely similar. That does make the rules quite complicated though, but it's worth it for the solid gameplay. The art style is gorgeous, and it carries over fairly well to the 3D digital version, and the soundtrack, composed by Michael Jason Corder, is a fun little group of forest shanties which fit the game well. Overall, Root gets a 39 for gameplay, a 17 for graphics, and another 17 for soundtrack, a total score of 74 out of 100. Moving on, we have Superhot, Mind Control Delete from the Superhot team. I'm a huge fan of the first game, and this sequel just about lives up to its predecessor by introducing roguelike gameplay elements and continuing the story of the first game. Whilst I definitely wasn't as into this as the original Superhot, it's still a very fun game that utilises bullet time as a gameplay element to its full potential. The graphics, whilst slightly improved, aren't a huge step up from the first game, but Mind Control Delete keeps the iconic red and white art style that makes the series really stand out. As for the soundtrack, composed by Zardonic, it's good, but not particularly memorable. Super Hot Mind Control Delete gets a 37 for gameplay, a 19 for graphics, and a 17 for soundtrack, an overall score of 72 out of 100. And our final game of August is Borderlands from Gearbox Software. It's a game that needs no introduction, known as a ridiculously fun co-op looter shooter with an absurd amount of weapons. I had a blast playing through Borderlands, and it's one of the surprisingly few games I played to completion this year. The story is great, the gunplay is awesome, the writing is hilarious, the graphics look great and have a really cool art style, and the soundtrack by Agerbæk-Larsen is pretty good. Borderlands gets a 43 for gameplay, a 20 for graphics, and a 17 for soundtrack, leaving it with an overall score of 80 out of 100. With August over though, let's continue to... Following my great time with the first game, we've got Gearbox's Borderlands 2 up next, which I actually managed to play with a friend, making the game even more fun than the first one. It's not just that makes this game better though, as Borderlands 2 adds even more weapons, even better gunplay, more interesting quests, even funnier writing, amazing and super poppy graphics, and a slightly improved soundtrack. Suffice it to say, Borderlands 2 is a huge improvement upon its predecessor in almost every way, which is why it gets a 46 for gameplay, a 23 for graphics, and a 19 for soundtrack. That's a total of 88 out of 100. Next up is The Plucky Squire from All Possible Futures, a game I absolutely fell in love with since the moment it was announced earlier in the year. In this one, you play as Jot, a character in a storybook who must manipulate words on the page, the outside world, and even the pages themselves in order to solve puzzles. During most of the game, you'll be walking around in either the 2D or 3D worlds, moving things around, but there are some sections where you'll be doing boss fights, all of which utilise some unique minigame inspired by other games. My personal favourite was the Rhythm Heaven-esque Mega Eagle fight. The Plucky Squire has an art style that is nothing short of absolutely charming, and the same goes for its amazing soundtrack composed by Mike Hjortjades. This game gets a 40 for gameplay, a 24 for graphics, and a 23 for soundtrack, an 87 out of 100 overall. And finally for September, there's Yada Soli's Seablip, currently in early access on Steam. This game feels like a fun mix between Sid Meier's Pirates, Stardew Valley, and Terraria, where you sail around, slowly gaining notoriety as a pirate captain. You can upgrade ships, get new crewmates, build up a home base, and take out other captains on the seas. Whilst its early access status means that there isn't much content right now, the developer seems to be pretty good at keeping the community informed of what he's working on, and I believe a big update released for the game fairly recently. Overall, the gameplay is generally fun, but could use a little work to make it more exciting and add more things to do. The pixel art graphics are very nice, and the soundtrack by Christian Balvig is quite boppy. Seablip gets a 36 for gameplay and an 18 for both graphics and soundtrack, meaning a total score of 72 out of 100. And now let's move over to the best month of the year. First game of October is Mint Rocket's Dave the Diver, a strange but fun combination between a roguelite diving game and a restaurant management sim. Surprisingly, the combo works really well, and the two sub-games have a lot to do with each other. You'll collect fish in the morning and afternoon to turn into sushi, and sell at your restaurant, which will give you more money to buy diving equipment to get more fish for the restaurant, and so on and so forth. Dave the Diver has a really fun gameplay loop, paired with a charming aesthetic and a great relaxing soundtrack by Jukio Kallio and DeAnthony Wooten. This one gets a 37 for gameplay, a 19 for graphics, and a 20 for soundtrack. That's a total score of 67 out of 100. Our next game is Black Salt Games' Dredge, another strange fishing game, this time combining the genre with Lovecraftian horror. Honestly, I really wasn't expecting much from this game, but I was absolutely blown out of the water when it provided a frankly incredible experience with an addictive gameplay loop, an incredibly well-written story with a brilliant twist, and honestly so much more. I could talk about this game for a lot longer, and I did, if you want to check out that video after this one. But for now, I'll only add that it's got a cute but simultaneously creepy art style that fits the story perfectly, and a spectacular and slightly unnerving soundtrack composed by David Mason. Dredge was so much fun to play to completion, and I'm really looking forward to going through the DLC, both of which I bought recently but haven't had a chance to play yet. This game gets a 44 for gameplay, a 22 for graphics, and a 23 for soundtrack. All in all, a score of 89 out of 100. Now, if you know me at all, you'll know I've been a big fan of the Kingdom series for years, so I was very excited to get my hands on the story-based spin-off Fury Studios' Kingdom 80s. It has the same brilliant gameplay loop as its predecessors: collect coins and use them to build up and defend your kingdom, but adds a beautiful new 80s themed coat of paint, along with a number of new gameplay features, including the aforementioned story, but unfortunately not the multiplayer features from Two Crowns. As a result, 80s is definitely not my favourite of the Kingdom games, but it's up there. Like I mentioned, it has really solid gameplay overall, paired with gorgeous pixel art graphics and a relaxing, more synthy soundtrack by Andreas Hold. I do prefer the music of Amos Roddy, who did the soundtrack for the main installments, but Hold does a good job of getting a similar vibe out of his music. Kingdom 80s gets a 40 for gameplay, a 24 for graphics, and a 17 for soundtrack, yielding a total score of 81 out of 100. Moving on, we now have Dodge Roll's Enter the Gungeon, a game that's as classic as can be for one that was released in 2016. I've technically had this in my library for years, but I rebought it on Steam back in October to give it another playthrough, and it's even better than I remember. It's one of the most roguelikey roguelikes out there, and arguably one of the most defining games of its genre in recent years. In Gungeon, you simply gun down enemies, fighting your way through the mysterious gungeon to reach the elusive gun that can kill the past. It's ridiculously fun, and has some of the best top-down 2D gunplay, boss fights, and humour that I've seen out of any similar games. On top of that, it's got charming graphics and an art style which includes as many guns as possible, as well as an action-packed soundtrack by Dose 1 that really gets you immersed into the gameplay. For those reasons, it's getting a 45 for gameplay, 22 for graphics, and 19 for soundtrack. That's a total of 86 out of 100. And the final game of October is Morbidware's The Text Assist, another weird mix of genres. This one is a bullet hell typing game where you play as Ray Bibia, an exorcist who must fight back against demons controlling Rome. Whilst a bullet hell typing game initially sounds like an absolutely terrible idea, the two genres work surprisingly well together, with you having to really concentrate on multitasking. The game is damn difficult, but not in a stupidly impossible way. With practice, I was able to make it through most of the game without too much trouble. The graphics are pretty good, and though I'm not the biggest fan of the occasionally quite gruesome art style, I'll admit that it fits the themes of the game very well. The soundtrack, composed by Ghost, is also pretty good, but nothing really to write home about in my opinion. The Text Assist gets a 38 for gameplay, an 18 for graphics, and a 15 for soundtrack, netting the game a total score of 71 out of 100. Now, with Spooky Month over, we're beginning to approach the end of the year. Next up, we've got... Here, our first game was Bendy and the Ink Machine from Joey Drew Studios, which I replayed in full following this Halloween's video on Mascot Horror. Look, it's overall a pretty good game, but at some points it has lazy storytelling that they clearly just made up on the spot, and drawn out gameplay where all you're doing is going from one point to another. I will say that this game does that fetch questy gameplay far better than many of the other games that came after it, but it's still not a subgenre I'm particularly fond of. The game does have great graphics though, and a really cool art style that I can honestly say I've never seen in any other games before, and the soundtrack by The Meatly and Ray Gould is full of solid tunes and a perfect fit for the game. Bendy and the Ink Machine gets a 30 for gameplay, a 20 for graphics, and a 19 for soundtrack. That's 69 out of 100. Next up though is Bendy and the Ink Machine's significantly better sequel, Bendy and the Dark Revival. This is an absolutely unbelievable improvement over the first game in almost every way. Story-wise, it rolls with the fairly random story of the first game really well, and develops it in an interesting way. Gameplay-wise, it moves on a bit from simple fetch quests, and makes the environments significantly more interesting to explore. It's surprisingly similar to games like BioShock, and features unique powers and significantly more interesting combat. Graphically, Dark Revival is leagues ahead of Ink Machine, featuring absolutely stunning graphics that keep the charm of the first one whilst noticeably improving how it looks. And as for the soundtrack by the Meatly, it's also even better than the first game. Benny and the Dark Revival gets a 41 for gameplay, a 23 for graphics, and a 20 for soundtrack, netting it a total score of 84 out of 100. And for our final game of November, we have Darkest Dungeon, the turn-based dark fantasy roguelike from Red Hook Studios. I'm a big fan of turn-based strategy games, and I'm glad to say that this one definitely hit the spot. The challenge of this game is the biggest draw, and it can be brutal at times in the most fun way possible. Kinda like another turn-based strategy roguelike I know. Anyway, there are so many cool elements of this game, like the unique party members, the management of their stats, including sanity, and loads more. I haven't played nearly enough of it yet, and it's one that I'm looking forward to completing next year. On top of the awesome gameplay, Darkest Dungeon has an incredible graphical style that works brilliantly with the gothic themes, and a dark and spooky soundtrack by Stuart Chatwood. This one gets a 43 for gameplay, a 23 for graphics, and a 22 for soundtrack, leaving it with an overall score of 88 out of 100. And now we're moving to the final month of the year. In December, I only played one game to a reasonable enough degree to include in this video, and that's Hacknet from Team Fractal Alligator. Hacknet is an incredibly immersive and detailed hacking simulator, where you hack your way into a multitude of different nodes in order to complete contracts for a hacking organisation. It's an interesting game at the very least, and though much of the hacking was disappointingly repetitive, the game is short enough that it didn't get boring by the time I'd finished it. Admittedly though, it was incredibly satisfying to learn all of the console commands and progressively get even faster at using them to navigate the game and hack into nodes. The story wasn't anything too special, but the little tidbits of writing you could find inside of different computers' file systems were nothing short of brilliant. Graphically, Hacknet does a good job at pretending to be a cool-looking hacker computer, like one you'd see in movies, and the soundtrack by a heap of artists whose names are on screen now is quite boppy, and again definitely makes you feel like you're a stereotypical hacker. Overall, Hacknet gets a 35 for gameplay, an 18 for graphics, and a 16 for soundtrack, an overall score of 69 out of 100. And that's it. Those are all the games I played this year. Now it's time to show them to you guys and see which games will win which awards in the 3rd annual Thing of the Year Awards. So let me once again introduce your host, REMUS Official, to present them. Take it away, REMUS.
Hello again, ladies, gents, to all of my guys and gals. Welcome once again to Artie B's Things of the Year, the 3rd edition in this now annual event of Artie B's YouTube channel. Today, as usual, we will be compiling a list that was voted on in the Artie B Discord server for all of our favorite things of the year, whether it be the best art, the best story, or who gets that ebony eardrum this year. Once again, my name is REMUS Official, and I'll be acting as your host for this year's Things of the Year. Let's get the ball rolling with the best art style for the most interesting, unique, and generally good-looking art style throughout the nominees. First up, we have Killer Frequency, followed by #Blood, next The Plucky Squire, and finally Bendy and the Dark Revival. With a total of 6 votes, winning just by 1, we have Bendy and the Dark Revival winning the Best Art Award. Moving right along to the Best Story Award, given to the game with the most captivating and well-written story out of the nominees. First up, we have Killer Frequency, followed by Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, next Hotline Miami, and finally The Plucky Squire. Coming in a two-way tie between Killer Frequency and Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered. You know, it's not often that you get to find an indie game and a huge corporation game put side by side on a tier list, but we love to see it. Moving on, we have the Best Roguelike Award, which is pretty self-explanatory, but let me give you the rundown. The best roguelike award is going to go to the game with the best roguelike elements or roguelike features, whether that be procedurally generated levels or, of course, most importantly, permadeath. We will just have to see what our contenders have to offer. First up on the list, we have Deep Rock Galactic Survivor, followed by Dave the Diver, then Enter the Gungeon, next with Darkest Dungeon. And coming in just by a hair with one vote is Enter the Gungeon for the best roguelike game of the year. Next up, we have the Best Sequel Award, given to, well, the best sequel. The thing that makes a good sequel is not necessarily if it has the best story, or if it follows that story, but overall the best improvements in every aspect. And for our list of contenders today, we have Helldivers 2, Slime Rancher 2, Borderlands 2, and breaking the chain of course, Bendy in the Dark Revival. Half of me is tempted to say 2. With all of this, it should come as no surprise that with just another 1 point difference, the winner is going to be Borderlands 2 with a total of 6 votes for the best sequel out of all 4 contenders. Now for the biggest question, is Borderlands 2 better or Borderlands 3? And next up, my favorite category. We have Best Voice Acting for the most fitting and well-performing voice actors, myself included. Shockingly enough, we have 5 different contenders for this. First up, we have Killer Frequency, Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, The Plucky Squire, and Bendy in the Dark Revival. And for your secret 5th option, obviously, me, for this segment. I'll go ahead and give you some time to change your votes. Coming in with 5 votes for both, we have a 2-way tie between Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered and Bendy in the Dark Revival. Shockingly enough, nobody voted for me. Next up, for my actual favorite category, we have the hottest character, which will go to the hottest character. First up, we have Rabbid Peach from Mario and Rabbids Kingdom Battle. Next up, we have Pink Slime from Slime Rancher 2. Thirdly, we have Red Guy from Super Hot, Mind Control Delete. And finally, the Ink Demon himself from Bendy in the Ink Machine. So many exquisite choices. Let's find out who won. It should come as no surprise that with a total of 6 votes, we have Red Guy from Super Hot, Mind Control Delete. Now, for the Funniest Game Award. For the game that's arguably given you the most sillies, the most ha-has, the most hee-hees, the most chuckles, the most knee-slappers. Whether it be from a bug, maybe some unintentional writing mistakes, or even something completely different. Our nominees for this award are Deep Rock Galactic, Helldivers 2, Borderlands 2, and Enter the Gungeon. 1, not 2. Surprisingly enough, there is a close tie for this one, but the winner is going to end up being, with 1 extra vote, Helldivers 2. Should come as no surprise when you're spreading that democracy. And now for a truly gnarly award, for the most gore. This award is going to go to the game with the most gore. Our nominees for the most gore award are going to go to Hotline Miami, Borderlands 2, and The Textorcist. Coming in with a tied vote yet again, we have Borderlands 2 and The Textorcist. Does that mean they're equally gory? Does it mean they mellow each other out? Who knows? Try them both. Find out for yourself. And if you, yourself the viewer, want to change the votes, make sure to join in next year in the RDB Discord server. Now the janitor's gotten all that gore cleaned up, let's talk about the Best Character Award, which will be awarded to the best written and most well-defined character from a game. Going back to our usual selection of 4, we have Forrest Nash from Killer Frequency, Peter Parker from Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, Handsome Jack from Borderlands 2, and Fisherman from Dredge. It should come as no surprise that coming in with a total of 8 votes, we have Handsome Jack from Borderlands 2. I mean, just look at him. Such a handsome lad. For my personal favorite category, we have the best indie game. This is going to go to the best game that was made by an indie developer. Some prime examples would be FNAF when it first started with Scott Cawthon, or Undertale with Toby Fox. However, those old gems are far too old for this list. So here's the new list with our new 4 nominees. For the best indie games, we have Deep Rock Galactic, Killer Frequency, Dredge, and The Plucky Squire. Coming in with a total of 7 votes, we have the esteemed Deep Rock Galactic, taking the world by storm. Or Stone. Rock and Stone. Next up, we have the Most Creative Award. No, it's not just a creative award, it's going to the most creative and well-written game. First up, we have Killer Frequency, followed by Mario Rabbids Kingdom Battle, next The Plucky Squire, and finally, Dredge. With an overall landslide victory, we have Killer Frequency with the Most Creative Award. And now for the Best Game Studio Award. This is going to go to the best developer and publisher of a multitude of great games. Unfortunately, we will be excluding many indie developers from this. First up, we have Ghost Ship Games, makers of Deep Rock Galactic and Deep Rock Galactic Survivor. Second in our list is Sony Interactive Entertainment, makers of Helldivers 2, Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, and many more. Third, we have Gearbox Software, makers of Borderlands and Borderlands 2. And finally, we have Devolver Digital, makers of Hotline Miami, The Plucky Squire, and Enter the Gungeon. Coming in with a 2-way tie, we have Ghost Ship Games and Sony Interactive Entertainment, both getting 6 votes. Congratulations, developers! Next up, we have the Best Updates Award. This award is going to go to the game that has consistently had the best and most well-rounded updates, whether it be quality of life, balance changes, or overall content added. Our nominees for the Best Updates Award are going to be Deep Rock Galactic, Helldivers 2, and Slime Rancher 2. And yet, shockingly enough, with a total of 8 votes, we have Deep Rock Galactic winning by a landslide. Seems the original will do better than the sequels this year. Next up, we have the Silliest Game Award, the award that will go to the most silliest game of them all, not to be confused with the Funniest Award. This one is simply for silly goofiness. First up, we have Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. If you've noticed, yes, this is the 3rd pronunciation that I have changed it. Next up, we have Hashtag Blood. Third, we have Slime Rancher 2. And fourth, a new contender, Root. Coming in with a 1-point difference, we have the silliest game, Slime Rancher 2, with a total of 7 votes. Next up, we have the favorite category for all the cool guys. This one is for explosions, but not just any explosions. This one is for the biggest explosions. Our nominees for this year are Deep Rock Galactic, Helldivers 2, Borderlands 2, and Enter the Gungeon. And with a total of 8 votes, the winner is Helldivers 2. After all, you're gonna have big explosions when spreading democracy. And now we get into the real brain pickers. We've got the Most Complicated Award. Again, it's just for the game that's most complicated. The award is fairly simple. Our lineup of contenders for this year are Assembly Line 2, specifically the mobile version, Risk Global Domination, Root, and Hacknet. It should come as no surprise that the age-old board game, that was then turned into a video game, is the most complex with a total of 6 votes, being Risk Global Domination. For our next award, we have the Fun with Friends Award. This award will be given to the game with the best multiplayer features. Our nominees for the Fun with Friends Award goes to Deep Rock Galactic, Helldivers 2, Root, and Borderlands 2. It should come as no surprise that something with one of the largest meme bases is the one that's gonna win. Trudging in with Rockin' Stone, we have Deep Rock Galactic with 7 total votes. However, that's gonna mark the end of my journey with you. For now, I'm gonna hand it over to the man himself, Artie B, for the last award and to give you the rest of the show. I've been Remus Official, your host, and you all have a great night tonight.
Thank you very much, Remus. Brilliant as always. But now it's time for the final 2 awards of the night, our most prestigious ones by far. First up is the Ebony Eardrum. As we all know, music is an incredibly important part of a good game. Without it, your game just feels empty, and if you get it wrong, it can feel like a whole different game entirely. Almost every game nowadays has an incredibly talented musician behind it, cranking out absolute bangers that act as the neat little bow that ties everything else in a game together. As such, the Ebony Eardrum is a community-voted award that will go to the game with the best soundtrack. So, without further ado, let's hear the nominees. First up is Hotline Miami, with an action-packed soundtrack by various artists that keeps your blood pumping as you gun your way through each of the game's levels. Second is The Plucky Squire, with a charming soundtrack composed by Mike Georgiades that makes the game feel so much more like a storybook adventure. Third is Dredge, with its creepy soundtrack by David Mason that keeps the player immersed in the Lovecraftian story the game tells. And finally, there's Darkest Dungeon, with its even creepier tunes by Stuart Chatwood that once again immerse the player in the gothic setting and fit the themes of the game perfectly. And the winner of the Ebony Eardrum Award, as voted by the RTB Discord server, is Dredge, composed by David Mason. With a landslide victory of 7 votes, it's easy to see, or rather hear, what makes this OST so good. Fitting the game's eldritch horror themes perfectly, David Mason's soundtrack is also just generally great to listen to, with my personal favourite track probably being The Exotic Traveller, one of the more upbeat tunes. With that said though, let's move on to our final award, the most prestigious award, maybe ever. That's right folks, it's the RTE, which will go to my personal favourite game of the year. Here are my nominees. First up, we have Deep Rock Galactic, Ghost Ship Games' addictive co-op miner shooter that scratched all the right itches for me, and had me playing non-stop for most of the year. Next up is Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, Insomniac Games' open-world RPG which really just made me feel like Spider-Man, one of mine and I'm sure millions of others' favourite comic book characters. Thirdly, we have The Plucky Squire, All Possible Future's ridiculously charming storybook RPG that just made me really happy while playing. And for our final nominee, we have Black Salt Games' Dredge, the Lovecraftian fishing game which had me well and truly hooked throughout my entire playthrough. Let me tell you folks, this was not an easy decision. Seriously, even choosing the nominees was an absolute chore, because this year has honestly been filled with nothing but bangers. If you look at the scores, there's not been a single game this video ranked beneath 50. And that's saying something, because a couple years ago we had Garfield Kart on the list. Anyway, enough babbling from me. The winner of 2024's RTE award is Deep Rock Galactic. Out of every single game here, Deep Rock has definitely provided me with the most fun times and memorable experiences, and getting to play almost every one of those hours with one of my best friends has really made it that much better. I honestly think that this is an almost perfect game and easily the best co-op experience I've had in recent years. So huge congratulations to Deep Rock Galactic and Ghost Ship Games for creating this absolute blast. And with all of that out of the way, that's all I've got for you. I hope everyone had a happy holiday season, and I wish everyone a brilliant 2025. I've got some cool stuff planned for this year, so be sure to stay tuned. In the meantime though, you can check out my backlog of videos here on the channel, or head over to the website, contentunavailable.net, links in the description, to read up on some Thing of the Week blogs, or just to see the awesome new site revamp. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you at some point in the future. Goodbye.